Hello everyone, welcome to our channel that takes you on an exciting journey through real-life mysteries and stories solved in the most intriguing ways. If you're a fan of captivating narratives and tales that make you rethink the world around you, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to support us by liking and subscribing so you won't miss any of our new content. We're thrilled to share this special story with you today. The Manson Family, the terrifying true story of the mastermind and the crimes that shook the world. In a dark corner of American history, where the strings of madness intertwine with ambition and despair, emerges a man named Charles Manson, who was not a killer by his own hands but by his mind. With his words, he bewitched weak minds and turned his followers into tools to carry out his grim vision of a new world. They were mere fragments of his twisted thoughts, in which he planted seeds of fear and absolute obedience. He led them through paths of blood and deceit, turning them into one family that made terror their language and murder their method. Under the bright California sky, which cast dark shadows over the homes of the wealthy and celebrities. This is the story of the Manson family, a story of people who gathered around a disturbed mind and scattered like bloody headlines in the newspapers, turning their lives and the lives of their victims into unforgettable nightmares. Charles Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His birth name was Charles Mills Maddox. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was a young teenager, just 16 years old, when she gave birth to him and was unmarried. Charles's father was unknown and left Kathleen shortly after she became pregnant. Later, Kathleen married a man named William Manson, from whom Charles took his last name. Charles had a very troubled childhood, growing up in an environment full of poverty and instability. His mother struggled with addiction and was incarcerated several times for petty crimes like theft. During these times, Charles was left in the care of relatives who did not provide him with a stable or loving environment. Some sources mention that he suffered from neglect and abuse in his early years, which deeply affected his psychological development. By the time Charles reached adolescence, he began to exhibit aggressive and illegal behaviors. He felt isolated and refused to engage with his peers at school. He started to get involved in shoplifting and other petty criminal activities. He had no sense of belonging and was always looking for ways to draw attention and prove himself. During this period, he was sent to several reform schools, where he spent most of his teenage years. Instead of rehabilitating him, these institutions only worsened his behavior as he learned more criminal tricks and methods from his peers. Charles Manson had a rebellious personality and often challenged authority wherever he went. He acted with great cunning, despite his young age, which helped him manipulate others to get what he wanted. His adolescence was full of failed attempts to adapt to society, which led him into a never-ending cycle of crimes and punishments, paving the way for his later life filled with chaos and crime. After leaving the reform institutions, Charles Manson expanded his criminal activities. In his early 20s, he became known in certain criminal circles for committing petty crimes like theft and fraud. However, his life began to take a different turn when he decided to move to California. In California, Manson started to interact with people who were victims of a fractured social life, such as those struggling with addiction or social marginalization. Manson exploited this situation to draw these individuals into the cult he later founded. He began using psychological manipulation on these young people who were searching for a purpose or meaning in their lives, and he had a knack for attracting them with his strange and unconventional ideas. Charles Manson started building his family in the early 70s when he attracted a group of young people who were victims of a troubled social life. They came from various ages and backgrounds and were often either socially isolated or victims of addiction or marginalization. Manson used psychological manipulation, promising them inner peace and answers to their spiritual questions. Among the significant people who joined the Manson family were Linda Kasabian, one of the main followers who later helped carry out the horrific murders. She was in her early 20s when she met Manson and was drawn to his strange ideas and spirituality. She became a key witness during Manson's trial, revealing many details about the cult and the murders. Susan Atkins joined Manson in 1967 and was one of his most prominent followers. She played a major role in carrying out the murders, including the killing of Sharon Tate and her friends. After her arrest, she confessed to her role in the crimes and became one of the most notorious figures in the story. Patricia Krenwinkel was one of Manson's close followers and joined him after abandoning her previous life in San Francisco. She contributed to carrying out many of the brutal murders and became one of his most loyal members. She lived with Manson on the desert ranch. Charles "Tex" Watson was one of the prominent male followers of the Manson family, meeting Manson in 1967 in Los Angeles. He was known for his role in the mass killing of Sharon Tate and her friends and was considered the mastermind behind many of the crimes committed by the cult. Manson attracted these people to his ranch in the California desert, where they lived together in isolation from the outside world. Manson planted ideas in their minds about revolution and race wars, using drugs and psychological manipulation to make them believe they had to commit murders in order to achieve these goals. Charles Manson began motivating his followers to commit crimes by planting ideas about the need to stir chaos and bring about social change through violence. He believed that American society was in a state of division and that a race war would soon break out. He saw this war as the only way to achieve enlightenment and liberation, and believed that he should be the leader of this revolution. Initially, Manson did not carry out the murders himself but directed his followers to do so. He used mental manipulation and drugs, brainwashing his followers to make them believe that committing murder was a legitimate means to achieve his goals. He selected individuals he considered most loyal to him and relied on them to carry out his plans. The most important of these were: Tex Watson was considered one of the most prominent male followers that Manson relied on for carrying out the murders. He was seen as the most powerful and loyal, acting as a leader during the killings. Manson trusted him especially, encouraging him to take charge and carry out acts of violence. Susan Atkins was one of the most loyal followers, and Manson relied on her for many of the violent activities. She felt great appreciation for supporting Manson and played a role in encouraging others to participate in these crimes. Linda Kasabian, she was one of the newer followers to join the cult at that stage. Although she didn't initially carry out the murders herself, she was present during the planning and execution phases. She provided detailed information about the movements and surroundings of the individuals involved. Manson incited his followers to commit crimes in pursuit of his distorted ideas about helter-skelter, a concept that, for him, meant the beginning of a racial war between blacks and whites. The first murder committed by Charles Manson's followers took place on August 7, 1969, and the victim was Gary Hinman, a person Manson knew and who lived in a rural area near Los Angeles. Gary Hinman was a quiet, kind man who worked in the music industry and was a former friend of a member of the Manson family. He was targeted because Manson believed that Hinman had money and that he could exploit him. Initially, Manson and his followers tried to obtain money from Hinman peacefully, but things quickly escalated. The crime began when Manson and his followers broke into Hinman's house in an attempt to force him to hand over money. Although Hinman didn't have the large amount of money they hoped for, Manson was determined to impose his will. He incited his followers to torture Hinman brutally. Tex Watson, one of the prominent followers who committed the crime, began issuing orders and instructed Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian to attack Hinman. They bound Hinman and then stabbed him multiple times. While Hinman screamed, Susan Atkins repeatedly struck and stabbed his face. The purpose of the crime was not just to kill Hinman, but Manson and his followers believed it was part of a larger plan to incite chaos. When the killers decided to finish off Hinman for good, they stabbed him several more times until he died. After the murder, they used his blood to write messages on the walls in an attempt to blame black groups and create a sort of social chaos, as Manson had planned. After the murder of Gary Hinman, the situation escalated for Manson and his followers. Initially, Manson believed that the murder would help him achieve his goal of sparking a racial war between blacks and whites, which he referred to as helter-skelter. After the murder, Manson and his followers tried to cover up the crime by making it appear as a racially motivated act of revenge. But events quickly developed, and the murder at Hinman's house was just the beginning. 2 days after the murder of Hinman, Manson and his followers began carrying out another, more bloody murder. The following night, Manson sent his followers to commit murders at other homes, and this time, the victims were more famous. The second murder committed by Charles Manson's followers occurred on August 10, 1969, and the victims were Leslie Van Houten and Stephen Person. That night, Manson sent his followers to another house in Los Angeles to carry out a new murder. This time, the victims were a young couple living in a house in the Los Virgenes area, somewhat removed from the outside world. Tex Watson, along with Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, carried out this crime. The goal of the crime was to continue with the plan that Manson believed would lead to chaos in American society. The four followers broke into the victim's house while they were in deep sleep. They began by tying up the victims and attacked Stephen Person first. Stephen was brutally killed with multiple stabs, then they moved on to Leslie Van Houten, who was repeatedly stabbed on the ground. The crime was filled with extreme violence. After the murder, Manson's followers left terrifying marks on the walls. They planned to leave other messages indicating that the murder was racially or chaos-driven, but this didn't mean there was any logical reason behind the crime. The third murder committed by Charles Manson's followers took place on the same day they carried out the murder of Leslie Van Houten and Stephen Person. This time, the victims were Dorothy Kraft and Harold Kramer. The goal of this crime was to instill fear and assert control over the victims, as in the previous murders. That night, Manson sent a group of his followers to commit a crime in a small house located in the Los Angeles area, in a neighborhood unfamiliar to those accustomed to the area. Manson believed that the perfect place to execute his plan was in remote villages. The victims were at home with their children, peacefully asleep when the followers broke into the house. The crime began when Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel decided to break into the house. They immediately confronted the victims and tied them up in their bedroom. The victims were met with threats and beatings, terrified beyond belief. The followers then began to torture them brutally, using sharp weapons to kill the victims. On the fateful night of August 13, 1969, Charles Manson's dark family carried out a new crime that would be even more brutal than the last. This time, the victims were William Craig and his wife Janet Wilson, who were living a peaceful life in their modest home on the outskirts of Los Angeles. They had no idea that this evening would mark the end of their lives. In the darkness, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel silently and quickly infiltrated the couple's home, slipping into their peaceful world like ghosts. Without warning or any chance to escape, the couple was tied up in a state of utter panic. The victims, struggling to understand what was happening, had no choice but to accept what was about to unfold. What happened next was horrific beyond imagination. The followers began to torture the couple severely, showing no mercy. Sharp weapon blows, screams of pain, and relentless attacks filled the space. No one showed mercy for the others. Unjustified cruelty overwhelmed the scene as everything was carried out according to Manson's orders, who had planted the idea of a racial revolution in the minds of his followers, believing these crimes would trigger the war he envisioned. After delivering their fatal stabs, the followers left behind distorted messages on the walls, written using the victims' blood, as if sending a message to the world. They believed these messages would provoke chaos and fuel the crisis Manson thought would change the course of history. But the truth was darker. These messages were merely a reflection of the family's madness and obsession with a terrifying ideology that controlled them. On August 15, 1969, the Manson family prepared to commit another murder, but this time the victim was more famous and more innocent. Mary Tatel, a beautiful young woman working at a small company in Los Angeles, was home alone when the dark group stormed into her house. That night, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, the loyal followers, intended to carry out Manson's command with all brutality. They had no intention of showing mercy and were under the influence of a terrifying ideology that made them view these murders as part of a larger plan to ignite a racial war. They entered the house quietly like ghosts in the darkness, and when they approached Mary, they knew they were about to carry out something horrifying. They quickly tied her up while shouting strange phrases and illogical threats, leaving Mary in total fear. She tried to resist what was happening, but they were faster and more brutal. Tex Watson, known for his violence, began the attack on Mary with a vicious stab to her body, while Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel delivered more deadly stabs. What followed was terrifying, with everyone in a state of frenzy and chaos, as the murder was a brutal, bloody process. After completing their heinous act, they left behind messages on the walls written in blood, each message more disturbing than the last, reflecting the madness and frenzy that had taken hold of them. Each message indicated that the family had orchestrated a killing spree with precision but driven by pathological motives. This crime was more than just the murder of an innocent person. it was a tactic to spark chaos as Manson had believed. On August 9, 1969, the murder of Sharon Tate became one of the most infamous and terrifying crimes in American history, but it was not the only crime committed by Charles Manson's followers that night. On the same day, they also killed J.C. Ringen and Stephen Person, friends of Sharon Tate who had been at her house when the brutal attack took place. That night, Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, was spending time with 3 of her friends, J.C. Ringen, a writer, Stephen Person, a close friend, and William Savage, a visitor. They were all at Sharon Tate's house in Los Virgenes, Los Angeles, where her husband Roman Polanski was absent due to work. Manson's followers broke into the house despite the fact that Tate's friends were not publicly known. They were randomly targeted by the group. They began tying them up and beating them savagely. In those moments, Susan Atkins, Tex Watson, and Patricia Krenwinkel approached the victims. While Sharon Tate and her friends were in shock and terror, the followers began stabbing them cold-bloodedly, and as the victims screamed for help, no one came to save them. Sharon Tate was brutally killed during this time, and while that happened, Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel wrote strange messages on the walls with the victims' blood, such as "pig," which symbolized the chaos that Manson sought to ignite. Along with this savage murder, J.C. Ringen and Stephen Person, who had been present at the scene, were also killed in the same brutal manner. Manson's followers left their bodies in the house, as well as the distorted messages that represented their twisted ideology. This murder was the beginning of a series of brutal crimes planned by Manson and his followers, aiming to ignite a racial war as Manson had believed. This particular crime became symbolic of Manson's madness and the hatred that was central to his destructive ideology. The Manson family was not involved in any type of legitimate business or traditional jobs. Instead, they relied on a lifestyle based on exploitation and living outside the framework of conventional society. Here are the activities they engaged in to support themselves. Living at Spahn Ranch. The members of the Manson family lived on an abandoned ranch called Spahn Ranch, located near Los Angeles. This ranch had previously been used as a location for Western movie shoots. Manson and his followers managed to stay there almost for free by exploiting the elderly ranch owner, George Spahn. Manson convinced Spahn to let them stay, while the women in the group performed simple tasks for him, like cooking, cleaning, and even emotionally satisfying him. They did not pay rent and instead relied on their relationships and exploited others' needs. Theft and trespassing. One of their main sources of income was theft. They would steal property, cars, and food from homes and stores. They would alter the VIN numbers of stolen cars to sell them or use them for transportation. They also trespassed on farmers' orchards in rural areas to steal food and supplies. Music and false hopes of fame. Charles Manson dreamed of becoming a famous musician, which was one of the reasons he moved to California. Manson tried to build relationships with music producers like Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, and convinced him to host some of the family members in his home for a short period. During this time, Manson exploited Wilson's resources and money before they were kicked out. Manson attempted to sell his songs by exploiting these relationships, but he did not achieve the success he hoped for, which increased his frustration and led him to focus more on his extremist plans. Drug trafficking. Some members of the Manson family were involved in drug dealing on a small scale. They traded small quantities of drugs such as marijuana and LSD, which they also used to psychologically control their followers. This activity was not organized or very profitable, but it helped meet their daily needs. Exploitation and begging. Manson relied on his followers, especially women, to collect money through begging or establishing relationships with wealthy men and exploiting them. Women were sent into the city to make friends with strangers and bring back money or supplies. Exploitive practices within the group. The members of the group worked together in a way that resembled a communal system. Everything they obtained from theft or transactions was shared among them, and Manson controlled the distribution of resources to ensure his dominance over them. In short, they had no legitimate trade or business but relied on theft, exploitation, and illegal activities. Manson used his personal charisma and psychological control to direct his followers to secure the group's needs through twisted and unethical methods. The Manson family's exposure in detail. The series of investigations began in August 1969 after a series of brutal murders shocked American society. Among the most notable of these crimes was the murder of the pregnant actress Sharon Tate and her friends, followed by the murder of the LaBianca family the next day. At first, the crimes seemed unrelated, as the police had no clear evidence connecting the events or pointing to the identity of the perpetrators. Initial investigations, mystery and search for evidence. After Sharon Tate and her friends were murdered in her home, the police found evidence at the crime scene, such as fingerprints, footprints, and words written in blood on the walls, like the word pig. However, these clues were not enough to identify the culprits, especially since the murders appeared to be random and brutal without a clear motive. The next day, a similar murder occurred targeting the LaBianca family, where words written in blood on the walls were found in the same manner. This is when the police began to suspect a link between the crimes. Initial arrests, theft and suspicion. The Manson followers were not initially arrested for the murders but for separate investigations into car thefts. The Manson family was living at the Spahn Ranch, an abandoned farm they used as a base for their activities. In October 1969, the police raided the ranch to arrest the group on charges of car theft and property damage. During the interrogation of some group members, clues began to emerge indicating their involvement in something larger. One member of the group, later known as the Manson Family, spoke to the police about the committed murders. Confessions in jail, turning point. While in jail, Susan Atkins, one of Manson's followers, confessed to a fellow inmate in horrifying detail about the murders. She told her how she had stabbed Sharon Tate and how they were all under Manson's instructions. The fellow inmate reported this confession to the authorities, providing the first solid evidence linking the Manson family to the murders. When police confronted Atkins about her confession, she began revealing more details about the crimes, including the names of those involved and the roles each member played in the group. Discovering, helter-skelter, the central motive. During the investigations, the police began to gather more information about Charles Manson and his beliefs. They discovered that Manson believed in an apocalyptic theory he called helter-skelter, which he thought signified an impending racial war. According to Manson, the murders were meant to create chaos and spark this war. When members of the family were interrogated, many confirmed that Manson was the mastermind behind the crimes, and that he used his psychological and emotional control over them to carry out his plans. Finding physical evidence and testimony. When searching Spawn Ranch and the locations where they were hiding, the police found stolen tools and items that linked them to the victims. Additionally, testimonies from some members who decided to cooperate with the police helped build the case. One significant piece of evidence was the fingerprint found on the door of Sharon Tate's house, which matched one of Manson's followers. They also found a knife and other tools connected to the crimes. The trial and full disclosure. When the trial began in 1970, the full story emerged thanks to testimonies and public confessions from some members. One of the most crucial confessions came from Linda Kasabian, who was a witness to the murders but did not actively participate in the killings. Her testimony was pivotal in uncovering the details of the crime and directly linking it to Charles Manson. The trial attracted widespread media attention, and the crimes and how they were uncovered became one of the most shocking events in American history. Thus, the story of the Manson family ends, remaining one of the darkest chapters in the history of crime. It reveals how disturbed individuals can exploit vulnerable souls and turn them into instruments of destruction. What happened is not just a series of murders, but a powerful warning about the danger of blindly following charismatic figures who use emotion and fear as weapons to lead others into chaos. Let us remember that the power of the mind lies in its freedom, and blind obedience can lead to disaster. Each of us has a responsibility to ourselves and those around us to be a light that illuminates the way, rather than being shadows moving in the dark. If this story has intrigued you and opened your mind to think deeply about the human soul, don't forget to support our channel, The Haunting Truth, so we can continue to deliver more captivating stories and deep investigations. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Together, let's uncover the truth and tell the hidden secrets of the past.